that would want it. Not a lot, but 3 or 4 maybe.
Well, I'd be more than happy to make the bet because this is all history.
Yeah.
And it's a wonderful piece of history. And I got to tell you the scene. Here it is, Bob.
Yeah.
2 weeks ago, I'm in Moscow.
Yeah.
I'm in Moscow doing something for the Jackson Center. And it was on the 60th anniversary of the commencement of the Nuremberg trials, and they were having an event.
Yeah.
And I'm traveling through Moscow with a translator.
Yeah.
And he asks me where I'm from.
Yeah.
And I told him I'm from Buffalo, New York. And he threw up his hands.
Yeah.
And he goes, "Oh, the scandal." "What scandal?" And he goes, "Alexander Mogilny." And I said, "Oh, you have no idea. The guy in the middle of all that is part of the law firm I'm a part of. Bob Swados." And he goes, "Oh, the scandal, the scandal." So it's a perfect segue. Tell me about the Mogilny story.
Well, word got around through the gossip that Alexander Mogilny, who was considered the most talented player in the Russian Federation, was talking about leaving. The money in the NHL was, much more than anything he'd get out of being a Russian player. And sure enough, we get word from Phil Esposito, who was then the general manager of the New York Rangers. He calls, I don't remember who he made the call to. It may have been Don Luce. He calls Don Luce and says, there's this player, Mogilny, or whatever his name is, seems quite talented, and he called me, or his agent called me, and, if you guys are not really interested, we'd be glad to take him on. So, word comes around the office, there's a big confab. I think it was Luce and somebody else at the moment. I'm sorry, I could check that up. He wants to defect. They get the word he wants to defect. So they go. I think it was to London, and they finally make contact with his agent, who couldn't speak English at all. And Alexander at that point couldn't speak English either. So. They managed somehow to get him into the United States. So at that point they come to the council. What are we going to do? we got to find some way to keep him here. Already the Soviets had heard that he'd left. They proceeded to trash his house, to fire her from her job at, I think it was a large retail store, and announced that he was a traitor, and in effect, they were out to get him. So the question came to me, how do we keep him here? I think I and my associates came up with the concept that the Russians had walked right into our trap by trashing her, by firing her, his mother, by announcing that he was a traitor. So, after a research of the immigration laws, we came up with the idea he could be a refugee, and we'd have to find some way to have him qualified as a refugee. Normally, a refugee is somebody that's been under surveillance for a long time and has the reputation like Solzhenitsyn or somebody like that, you know, of being a great independent individual entitled to be treated in the U.S. laws. But that wouldn't work, so I got hold of Amo Houghton, who was then the representative, United States representative in Wyoming County. He was a friend of Seymour Knox's, and he soon became a friend of mine. He was so enthusiastic. You're not going to let the Soviets take this guy away. He proceeded to put me in touch with the Assistant Secretary of State. We had more trouble with the local immigration people than we had with the Assistant Secretary of State, but finally, after about a month of negotiations and conversations and trip to Washington and everything else, they finally agreed, yes, we will qualify him as a refugee under the Refugee Act, and therefore he's entitled to remain in the United States as a permanent resident, which was very helpful up to a point. So the next question came, what do we do when we play in Canada? So I called various people. I had been involved in the negotiation of the Canada-U.S. tax treaty, the most recent one. So I had some contacts. Yeah, don't worry about it, Bob. We won't let them get them. So that wasn't sufficient. So I called the lawyers in Montreal who had represented the Canadians for some time. I said, listen, when this guy comes over, I want him to be watched. I want to make sure that wherever he goes, there's somebody available in case they try to pull anything, because, you know, this is Stalin-esque tactics that are going on here. So fortunately, they didn't make a move at that point. But about 2 weeks later, I get a call from the NHL, from, I think it was, at that time it would have been John Ziegler's office, I guess. So, that was 1989. So whoever was on the phone said, Bob, one of the Russians has been in here, one of their lawyers, and they want to talk to you, and we think you should talk to him. So I said, well, I'll talk to him, but we're not going to let this guy go. We're not going to let this kid go. He's highly talented. He's entitled to be at the top levels of the business, and we're just going to let him go. So I go to New York and go into the NHL office, and there's a guy sitting there with a long beard. He looks like a combination of Stalin and my father. But he didn't behave like my father. He actually threatened me. He said, you have stolen this player, you kidnapped him, you were violating international law and all else. He said, you know, at the end I said, I'm sorry. Under our system, this kid is entitled to carry out his life and his career here, and we're not going to let him go. That was the end of it. So I expected that I'd get some kind of a lawsuit or something, but ultimately nothing happened. So Alexander, you know, came onto our team, and in the year that he was paired with Pat LaFontaine, he had 76 goals. Yeah. Which was, I think, was tied for the number of goals that year, and one of the highest in the history of the league. He was, you know, very talented, and that year it was one of the most exciting years in the history of the Sabres individually. Not like the current team, which is really wonderfully exciting. Anyway, so. After this has been taken care of, my wife said to me, okay, come on, let's go on a vacation somewhere. So I said, sure. She said, because she was very hep on travel. So she plots a travel agenda that took us into the Mediterranean, into the Hellespont, Turkey, and finally into Russia. And it was in the south on the Black Sea, I guess. So when we boarded the plane in Buffalo, Nordy Knox says to me, "Bob, when you get to Russia, don't get off the plane." If you're in the boat, don't get off the boat. He says, "The Russians don't like you." I'm not sure. So then the end of the story was that, we ended up in the towns. Yalta was one of them, and another in that area whose name escapes me at the moment. I remember my wife saying, "Why are the streets so clean?" I said, "Because they've been washed with blood." So, as it happened, in the middle of the tour, I started to feel ill, and I went to see the ship's doctor, who was Swedish, in spotless white uniform with gold braid and gold buttons. And I described what happened to him, and I was starting to get little spots on the inside of my hands. So he takes this big, thick book, and he opens up the book, and he's reading the book, and he finally says, "Mr. Swados," yes, "Mr. Swados, your voyage is destroyed unless you let me give you something to knock it out." So what do I say? Here I am, 14,000 miles away from home. So he turns out that he gave me tetracycline. And the doctors think, even though I remember swimming in the pool and swallowing a lot of water on the ship's pool, but the doctors think that was the tetracycline, which does have serious consequences. They've seen it in children who've had it or have had self-leak. So all I know is I was feeling ill and really seriously ill, and this guy didn't have the slightest idea what it was or what to do about it. So fortunately, my wife Vicky said, "We're going home," and she got hold of the head guys at Lufthansa and the head guys at U.S. Air, and they got me home in about a day and a half, and went into the general hospital. Unfortunately, there were two doctors there, Dr. Stephanie, I remember her first name was Stephanie, and then Dr. Brass, who was in charge of certain types of diseases, and they recognized it as Stevens-Johnson syndrome. So I was in special care for 3 weeks and nearly died, but I came out of it all right as a result of the fact that they recognized it so soon. They shot me full of prednisone or some similar so it came out all right. My daughter tells stories about how I was under it so badly and was reciting all these strange tales, probably about McGillney. So that's the story of Alexander McGillney.
Well, it found its start in Russia only 2 weeks ago. Unbelievable.
Yeah. Well, actually, I went to the Jewish Center out here to be part of head of a discussion group. And after I was in the discussion group, I was waiting for my cab, and I'm sitting on. So there's these two guys there. I said, "Can you see?" Because it was this stuff. "Can you see there's a cab there?" He says, "No, there's no cab." He says in a Russian accent. No cab there. So I said, what do you do? And he told me what he did. And he says, what do you do? I said, I'm a lawyer, but I'm known as a sort of a hockey mogul. So then he says, well, what did you do? I said, well, I was a lawyer for the Buffalo Sabres. Oh, Alexander McGillney, yeah, Moscow. He played for Moscow.
Well, they still remember him.
Yes, yeah. Well, I won't mention this, but basically what happened was, I also remember when we were in the playoffs, and I was sitting right in back of the goal, and Alexander, I think he was sort of tired or fed up or something. He must have made 6 drives on the goal and threw them all over the top of the net. And at that point, I think it was John Muckler who said, Pat wasn't there anymore, or Pat was, so he was on my own, and he didn't have anybody who was fast enough or quick enough. Any one of the guys on the team today would have been great for him. Sure. But I think he's just sort of lost interest. So John Muckler decided just to trade him, and he traded him to Vancouver. I remember I went out to Vancouver. Maybe the meeting was in Vancouver. I can't remember where he ended up, but we got quite a few. We got a couple of draft choices and a couple of regulars. So it was a pretty substantial trade. I didn't think it was enough, but Muckler did. So he ended up being traded, and we got some pretty decent players, but nothing of the caliber of Alexander McGillney.
How did you deal with the fact when the Sabres played the Russians? There was an exhibition game. Was McGillney...
Well, by that time, a deal had been made. See, that actually the McGillney transaction forced the Soviets to enter into a treaty. We'd had treaties with Sweden, Finland, Germany, some of the other countries, Norway, and we had been trying to get the Soviets to agree that we could take their players under whatever conditions there were, and they could take our players, that was the theory, and then we'd be trade off and we'd enter into international competition. So that was all part of it. And as a result of that, the Soviets finally had to give in and permit the transaction to be made. And when the NHL took one of their players, they had to make a dollar contribution of some kind or some other transaction. So when he was traded, by that time, that issue had been eliminated. That's my recollection anyway.
You were there at the beginning, Bob, and it's such an interesting story when reading the book of the Sabres and the Oakland. That's a part of the history that's long lost.
Yeah.
That you made the pitch for the original, or the expansion after the original 67.
67, yeah.
67?
Yeah.
For the camera, how did that play out where you didn't get it, but you ultimately, it led to you getting it in 70, 71? Well,
I think I tell the story in my book that when we went to the 1967 meetings of the league, at which they decided which teams would come into the league, we thought we had the absolutely best presentation from every point of view. And I tell the story that after we were made our presentation, Jim Norris, who was then one of the principal owners of the Chicago Blackhawks, and his brother Bruce was the principal owner of the Detroit Red Wings. And the days go back to when they talked about the NHL as the Norris House.
Yeah.
So he sees me in the corridor, Jim Norris says. He says, Mr. Swados, I just want to tell you, you're the best lawyer here. you got the best presentation, you got the best financing, you got the best people, but you're not gonna get it. That was, and why were we not gonna get it? Well, number one, the Norrises had a hard-on, I would say, for the fact that they lost a lot of money in the grain business when the grain business disappeared from the Buffalo area. Secondly, Bruce Norris, who ran the Detroit Red Wings, was not too happy about another club at the border. The Toronto people were hostile, and they remained hostile for, I would say, 20 years. They had the notion that if they let Buffalo in, we were going to take away their television revenue, because very early on, from 1954 on, the U.S. television stations in the Buffalo market were the main source of entertainment in Toronto. Right. In fact, you would see these high antenna on all the houses near the escarpment because they wanted to catch the signal of the VHF stations in Buffalo, and they couldn't without having the houses having these high antenna. So the people in Toronto, the guy who owned Channel 9, the two principal operators of the franchise there, whose names I have said many times, Harold Ballard and his friend and colleague, both of whom went to jail.
That's Stafford Smythe?
Stafford Smythe, yeah. They were hostile. They were very opposed. They didn't want Buffalo in. They were sure that we would take away not only television revenue, but we would take away people. Mm-hmm. So Bill Jennings, who was a very prominent lawyer in New York City, Simpson, Thatcher, and Bartlett was the name of his firm. He was the president of the New York Rangers. Mm-hmm. And he took a candle to me, the way I handled things and everything else, the way I dealt with the people. And they felt, the Rangers felt it would be a good thing to get Buffalo in. Mm-hmm. And they liked the Knoxes and the other people in the George Goodyear and the other people involved. And
by the way, who were some of the other people involved?
Well, at that time, the Shelkoffs, right. Fred and Paul Shelkoff. As I say, the Knoxes at the early on. These were the people who were involved in the television business. Mm-hmm. And we made a lot of money for those people over a 10-year period. Ended up owning 17 television stations and wow. Sold it for this young lawyer had to negotiate the deal, which was the largest deal in the history of television at that time. So they made a lot of money, and I always found, whether I was trying to get into baseball, trying to get us into hockey, I always was able to tap into them because they were enthusiastic. They liked the way we had handled it. They had confidence, and they had money. So you had people, as I say, like Goodyear, the Shelkoffs, the Knoxes peripherally at the start. Bill Rupp, not Bill Rupp, I can't remember, the Rupps. George Gregory, who was a friend of Seymour, investment banker. I mean, a whole bunch of prominent Buffalo people. There also was a group of Democrats like Peter Crotty, Gene McMahon. See, one of the things we'd done when we'd organized the television company was merged the claims of our crowd, which was primarily Republican, and the other crowd, which was primarily Democratic. So we had prominent people, Pat McGroder, you know his name from football. So we really had a terrific bunch of people, so that every time we had a problem, all I had to do was make some telephone calls and the money would be up there, including the Buffalo News with Mrs. Butler, also Lou Jacobs, Sports Service. He ended up helping finance the building that went on. But so we really had a terrific bunch of people, very representative of Buffalo, and they had drive, and they didn't you didn't push them around very easily. And that was one of the reasons when Bill Jennings looked at it, he says, Jesus, your guys, you should be in the league. You'll be an asset to the league.
Sure.
So when they turned us down in 1967, the Knoxes and everybody, and I guess maybe me too, were mad as hell because they took in 6 franchises, one of which was St. Louis. St. Louis didn't have an owner. They didn't have anybody to point to put up the money. But since the building was owned by the Norrises, they were going to give a franchise.
Oh,
And this is what is known as the economics of oligopoly. Anyway, so at any rate, we were mad as hell. And I remember Bill Jennings coming. It was staged in the nightclub sort of atmosphere, coming behind the flat, the flat being the term for the scenery. Hey, Bob, tell your clients not to get so mad, he says. Sooner or later, the league is going to want to come back to you because you're too good a setup, too good a bunch of people. You know what to do, and just calm them down. Mm-hmm. So I went back and I talked to Steve. You got to listen to Jennings. He's our best friend in the system. So as it happened, one of the franchises that they had given in 1967. How are we doing for time here?
I'm fine. How are you doing?
What time is it?
Oh, it's a little after 3:30.
Oh, that's fine. Anyway, one of the franchises that was given in 1967 was Oakland. Why Oakland? Oakland had a building. Oakland had a hockey building. San Francisco did not. So they had to worry about getting the more wealthy people who lived in the Bay coming across the Bay into Oakland. And that worry turned out to be significant because they just couldn't seem to get the fans to come across the Bay and whatever they did in terms of players wasn't very successful, although they had good people, including Bill Torrey, who had been the general manager for quite a while, and ultimately ended up being general manager of the Islanders. But they had good people there, but they just couldn't crack it, even with the money from Bing Crosby and who had some money in there, and his friends who I got to know quite well. So about sometime in when would it have been?
68?
Yeah, 68. I get a call from Jennings. Bob, the Oakland franchise is in financial trouble. Can you help? If you can help, maybe you can move it to Buffalo. Mm-hmm. So I make my telephone calls that afternoon. Okay, go ahead. How much? They need about $1 million. Mm-hmm. 3,000 miles away from Buffalo. They need $1 million. Okay, we'll we'll put it together. So I go out there to negotiate the deal with Crosby's friends and the other guys, including one of them was Nelson Doubleday, who was, one of the owners of the publication, who was very nice and was friendly and so forth. And it turned out that they had 55 partners.
Oh my God.
So the first thing the league says to me, Bob, whatever you're going to do, you got to set this out so we don't have to deal with 55 people, because that was one of the problems with Oakland. There was never anybody we could look to. So I worked out a voting trust under which the two Knoxes and I were the voting trustees, and we represented everybody, and we could handle the board and everything else. Except to that. So, but anyway, so I negotiate this contract, and I think it was on over Friday and Saturday of that weekend, and there was a game on Sunday. So I said to the guys in Oakland that I'd negotiated with, well, look, can I see my team? so yeah, but he says, we can't let it out that this is being sold to a Buffalo crowd, because that'll kill the rest of the season. Sure. So I said, okay. He says, now that means you can't come at the beginning of the game. You got to come after the game. You got to wear a hat. You can't have any symbols on you of any kind, and you have to leave early so that the crowd won't see you take off. So I said, okay. And I went through all those peregrinations, and the following morning, Monday morning, Buffalo crowd buys.
Oh my gosh.
So that demonstrated to me, if I needed it, that nothing in professional sports will be secret for long. So here we are, the owners of a franchise 3,000 miles away, and we applied to the league to have it transferred. As it happened the same time that Vancouver was trying to get the Oakland franchise transferred to Vancouver. The league turns that down, and then ours comes up, and ours, I'm told by Jennings, it won't fly. I said, why not? Toronto and Chicago and Detroit, the same thing. They're all opposed to it. So I said, what the hell should we do? He says, my advice to you is to stay in. We'll get somebody else to put up the rest of the money. And if you stay in, that'll be such a benefit to the league, and ultimately they'll let you get a Buffalo franchise. Which is basically what happened after a few steps. It turned out that the guys who were going to put up the rest of the money didn't have it. They represented Whitey Ford, Pat Summerall, and somebody, and they were going to be a sports magnate.
Right.
But they didn't have any money. They didn't have enough money, so we were sitting there with the only deep pockets. And ultimately, to shorten it, Charlie Finley happened to be, at that time he was, tops in Oakland. His A's were the most successful baseball team practically in recent memory. So he decided, since he was going to be in Oakland, he didn't want anybody else to have an interest in the baseball team or in the stadium or arena or whatever it was, so he decided he wanted to buy it. He could use the same personnel for baseball in the summer as for hockey in the winter, and that would save time, money and all that jazz. So fortunately, he bought the franchise from us, was in fact reimbursing us for some of the money we had put up. And as a result of that, when the time came, meantime, Vancouver was pressing to get a franchise and were angry that franchises had gone out without going to Canadian, and that's when the second expansion was put together with Vancouver and Buffalo. And that's how we ended up, finally, after 4 years, getting the Buffalo Sabres.
What did you sense when they finally come behind the curtain and they go up and say, "Bob, congratulations"? What was your reaction? Or did you know it was coming?
Yeah, well, I didn't know it was coming, but it was like you're moving down the ice and you make passes and you knock out somebody and finally you get in front of the goal and you can put it in. That's basically what happened.
Did they ask? Were there any conditions? Did you have to expand the auditorium?
Yes, definitely. At that time, Memorial Auditorium, then called the Odd, had only a capacity of 10,000, and the expansion plan in the NHL required 15,000. And one of the ways that we managed to triumph was that we found that Baltimore and Cleveland, that were our competition, did not have the physical ability to expand. So they were stuck with 10,000 or building an entirely new arena.
Right. Whereas
our engineers told us that we could expand the Odd, and we did in what was a very dramatic engineering feat, where we raised the roof, and it had to be raised at every point at exactly the same time. You raised the roof, poured concrete into the opening between the top of the original building and put seats in where the concrete was and got it up to, I think it was ultimately 16,000.
Yeah. And I remember sitting at the top row more games than not.
Yeah.
One of the more interesting things that you put in your book about, your first draft, the draft, was Gilbert Perreault, and the fact that at the time there was the old sponsorship system that had just gone out, or you would have never had a shot at Gilbert Perreault.
Yeah, not only the sponsorships, but at that time there was still the rule that the French Canadians had first crack at the first 2 French Canadian players in the draft,
right,
regardless of what their standing was. Fortunately, that was kicked out. Otherwise, we never would have got Perreault.
Was he the guy? Was he the guy you wanted? I mean, was he not?
Oh, absolutely. He was far and away the best draftee, in many ways, and he was the franchise at the beginning of the ownership.
Was he the best that you saw? I mean, Bob, you were there at the beginning, almost.
Yeah, I believe he's the best player I've seen in the National Hockey League. Scotty Bowman told me that at that time the Buffalo, the Odd, had a short, and its rink was short by about 5 feet, and the corners were cut because it was not as wide as it should have been. So according to Scotty, Gilbert was inhibited from working in the corners. And he said that if he had been in a full-length, full-width arena, he would clearly have been recognized as the best player in hockey. In my opinion, he was. I mean, there was nobody who could go down the ice, go through the whole team and score. And he'd do it frequently, too. I mean, he had very strong ankles. You don't realize it. And he could make almost any maneuver. Yeah. And a fine shot. And he was big and strong, and he just had all the equipment. The only knock on him was that he was too talented, so he didn't have to work so hard.
Right.
Yeah. But I never thought that. And I also, as I mentioned in the book, I spent one evening with him during the season when he broke his leg, and that was really surprised and pleased at how well he knew the game and how he could analyze it and how he, notwithstanding his French accent to the English, you know, I thought that was a great evening. I spent the most educational evening, except for the one I was with Punch Imlach.
Well, good segue. That was my next thing about Imlach.
Yeah.
How did you get him? The circumstances around getting such a dynamic individual right across the border.
Well, he had been working for Harold Ballard in Toronto, and they'd have some disagreements as everybody did with Harold, I guess. And either he quit or he just was let go. I think he was let go because either Harold Ballard or some of the other Silver Seven, or where they were that owned the franchise, didn't want him. So after we were told we were going to get the franchise, which was in the spring of, the spring of '69, yeah. I get a call from Clarence Campbell. Mm-hmm. And, hey, Bob, have you done anything about your general manager? I said, no, we haven't, Mr. Campbell. We haven't had time. We got so much to do. We had to get the money together. We had to work out leases and so forth. He says, it's very important. He says, and there's a man available. If you took him, it would be a 10 strike, the bowler,
Sure.
A 10 strike. So who is it? It's Punch Imlach. So I checked around, called him, and we arranged for him to come to Buffalo with Seymour Norty and me. And after listening to him, we all agreed he was the guy. He proceeded to tell us that we had paid too much for the franchise, which was $6 million plus. You paid too much. So he evidenced right away he was not just a hockey man. He was a businessman. He was a PR guy. He could write. He could joke. He had a sense of humor. He had drive. He worked hard. And he got along with people. He was just the right guy for what we needed. And he knew so much about the business that he was able to bring us, as you know, into the playoffs at the end of the third year.
Sure.
And in the finals in the fifth year. Yeah. So we were lucky, as we were with Perro, we were lucky with him because we had probably one of the 2 or 3 best hockey men in the business. And as I say, the best thing about Punch was he was not just a trader. He was not just a negotiator. He could do almost anything. And his PR sense and the way he could talk to the press and talk to the team and so forth was outstanding, and that helped us an awful lot.
You said you had an evening with Punch Imlach. That was one of your highlights.
Well, I'm sorry, I don't think it was with Punch. I think it was with Scotty Bowman. Yeah. Punch, I had a lot of discussions with. One particularly, well, lawyer, I want to draft this one-eyed kid. Can I draft him? Well, Punch, not under the present regulations, but the present regulations are probably violative of the antitrust laws. So if you want to go for him, you can go for him, but I can't predict how they'll come out in the courts. Let's go for him. That was Neild, N-E-E-L-D, Neild, whose one eye was below requirements.
Well, since you brought up Scotty Bowman and one night with him, we'll conclude on that kind of story.
Yeah. Well, the first year, we decided that we wanted to find out how everybody else was operating. And Scotty had been, I think, a general manager of the Blues for a while before he went to Montreal. At that time, he was still with the Blues. And Seymour and I went there. We wanted to see what kind of building they had, what kind of entertainment facilities, how they handle things, and so forth. So the game starts, Buffalo against St. Louis, and Scotty is there. We're all in the press box. Seymour and I have the program out there. So after a while, after the game developed and St. Louis was winning quite easily, as I recall it anyway, Scotty comes over, he leans over and he says, "Mr. Knox, do you mind if I make a few comments?" I said, "Yes, go ahead." "Get rid of this guy, get rid of this guy, get rid of this guy, trade this guy, send this guy down." He went through the whole roster.
No kidding.
Yeah, and he had the plans all worked out for us, which were mostly, as I say, get rid of these guys. Because, of course, they were all, in those days, you didn't get very much up front. And part of what you got was draftees, and the other part was what you called intra-league drafts, where you could take players from the other teams. And those, in the eyes of the hockey men, were generally, if not junk, at least they were not worth spending a lot of time with, a lot of years with. So that was his, he was saying, get rid of those intra-league draftees and get yourself some first-class hockey players and rely on your draftees, who turned out to be very valuable, people like Perrill and Martin and others.
Well, this has been terrific, Bob.
Okay. Well,
I know we got time, and I know you got an event coming up later on here.
yeah, well, I'm almost ready. I just got to decide what kind of a tie to wear. I had to end up making a judgment on.
Did I send you some stuff on the Jackson Center? Did I? I know I meant to. Anyways, if I said